Welcome to Dear Business Coach, the podcast. My name's Elizabeth, coming to you from the Walker Consulting Works studio. Find one thing to move your business forward today. With conversations, spotlights, interviews, articles, and free resources. Listen, follow, and subscribe on social media. Dear Business Coach Podcast. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube. And don't forget Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. All it takes sometimes is one little thing to move your business forward today. So I'm recording on Zoom. Me, check, 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 me, check, 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 check. Going live. Unmute to speak. We are in pre-live and going live. Going live once, twice. We are now going live. I see green circles around my profile picture, so I believe we are live. Hello, so welcome to, so you're a podcast guest, now what? My name is Elizabeth Walker, your host today on this LinkedIn Live. I'm also the producer and host of the Dear Business Coach podcast. Visit me at dearbusinesscoachpodcast.com. And you can choose how you want to experience the show. Watch on YouTube, pick your favorite podcast player. You can also link all to social. There are also social groups, LinkedIn, Dear Business Coach Podcast, and Facebook, Dear Business Coach Podcast, where you can catch clips, reels, and episodes. So today on this LinkedIn Live, we're talking about what to do when you are a podcast guest. So if you have ever been on a podcast, kudos to you. It is one of the top ways to make a meaningful connection with your audience, capital Y-O-U-R audience. Now, I want to give a shout out right now to Mimi Langley. She is a social audio coach. I call her a social audio coach. Her profile actually says social audio moderator coach. And so this is a nice warm up. It's 9:30 Eastern time, Monday morning, a vocal warm up for me, and hopefully a way for you to pick up some tips. Hopefully you have a podcast meeting or recording scheduled for you and your business this week or next. And the best way to do that is jump in, get invited to a podcast. You can reach out to the Dear Business Coach podcast. And if you are a business owner and would like a business spotlight, if you're a business expert, an industry expert, if you have something that you would like to showcase, have you written a book? Do you have a workshop? I want to hear from you. That's dearbusinesscoachpodcast.com. One of my specialties is helping people who have never been on a podcast before. That makes you a spotlight guest, right? So let's find something you want to talk about that you're excited about today in your business, and let's help get you some exposure, because I know you have lots of wonderful things to say, and I want to hear all about you and your business. So you can go to dearbusinesscoachpodcast.com, and right there you can select, there's a button that says get interviewed on the Dear Business Coach podcast. There's a link to be a guest at the top, where you can fill out just your name and contact information, and you can upload media. If you'd like me to see specific media that helps me just take a look at what you have, if you've never been on a podcast before, and you and I can talk about what would be a good spotlight for your business based on content you give me. So I can help you with that. That's dearbusinesscoachpodcast.com. And right on my LinkedIn profile, I'm Elizabeth Walker. The profile handle is Elizabeth Walker at Work on LinkedIn. And the live link in my bio, right underneath my bio on LinkedIn, says listen, watch, and subscribe. That goes to a link tree. That goes to my link tree. So you can see details about the event that I'm hosting here in Roanoke this fall, and link to the Dear Business Coach podcast show right there. So that is a good resource for you to get started if you've never been on a podcast before. So What to do when you are a podcast guest. Our checklist today is actually basically three things. Number one, we want to make sure that you have your call to action ready. Let me take a sip of my coffee here. Your call to action. Now, I'm bringing the call to action up first because pro tip here, not my pro tip. I picked this up from a couple of pros, but number one I'm thinking of is Beth Nidick. She is an expert at helping you get yourself on television and getting exposure on television. And she has a podcast talking all about getting exposure, and podcasting is one of the things that she wants to help you maximize to get exposure in your business. Beth Nidick says that we should be talking about our call to action items right at the beginning of our introduction. When someone invites us onto a podcast, have your call to action ready and have it wrapped into your introduction. When a podcast host reads your bio and says hello and how are you today and all of that at the beginning, have a couple of sentences ready. Mine is, hey, my name is Elizabeth Walker. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm producer and host of the Dear Business Coach podcast. You can see me and the show at dearbusinesscoachpodcast.com. And that way, right away at the beginning of the conversation, your guests, your audience can start following you right away. You've already made a connection at the very beginning of the show, regardless of if something happens and that listener drops off in the middle of the show or what have you. You're going to say your call to action a couple of times, right? You'll say your call to action, hopefully peppered throughout your interview, and definitely at the end, your podcast host, will ask you to please let us know where we can find you and how to connect with you. And that's where you throw in that call to action, but have it ready at the beginning as part of your introduction. Now, why should you listen to me? Well, for one, because I am obsessed with podcasts and I listen to podcast experts all day long, trying to get the best out of their knowledge to bring to my podcast. I love podcasting. I have my podcast because I personally understand the power of making a connection over a podcast. Hey, Laura. And so this live event is exactly that. It's a way for me to practice talking about the power of podcasting and to give folks who are interested in being on a podcast some tips on how to make the most of your episode when you're the guest. So have your call to action ready. That way you can wrap it into your introduction when you are a guest, have it pepper throughout your interview, and then of course when you are asked at the end of your interview. But the reason why Beth Nidick tells us to throw in at the beginning is so that people can connect with you right away, click on your LinkedIn profile, find your website, jot down your name when they meet you through your introduction at the beginning of your episode. So why podcasting? We know if you're listening to this live right now that you're a fan of podcasting in some shape or form. But one of the things that I heard recently on Angela Duncan say, both when she was a guest on my podcast and repeatedly on her own content, she says that there are at any given time approximately 1.5 million people listening to podcasts. And it is literally virtually free for us to produce content, whether you're a guest or a host. I produce my podcast on Spotify. The RSS feed goes out to everywhere that Spotify will let me distribute it. And I actually find new places to distribute my podcast that are just free. Pop in the RSS feed. I found one today. So you never know where your episode will land. And if there are 1.5 million people listening to a podcast somewhere right now as we speak, think about what that means for you. If, for example, you get to hop on a podcast episode for your business, it's no cost to you and the host to sit there and have a chat for a while. And then your voice gets distributed to people who are going to be your ideal audience instantly. And what makes a podcast so personable is you get to be right in that person's earbuds, right in that person's brain for the duration of that conversation. I know that I personally enjoy listening to podcasts as a way to learn, but also as one of my favorite comedians, he's a podcaster, Jared Freed says, he tells his listeners to come to his podcast to put your brain on a shelf, put your brain on the shelf for 30 minutes or an hour, whatever it is that you're there for. And it's a way for you to take a break from whatever you're doing for the day, maybe get a shift in change in attitude or a change in perspective, listening to a conversation, whether it's for entertainment or education. So as a guest, you have a way to pop into, the hearts and minds of your audience instantly. Tracy DeForge is an expert at podcasting. She also was a guest on Angela Duncan's show, and I took some notes. I've been conversing with her back and forth. She's hopefully going to be talking with me soon here on the Dear Business Coach podcast about what it means when you are having a conversation over a podcast about your business versus just a clip or something that's traditional marketing via video or audio clip, right? Because your personal voice, you're actually giving your audience your inflection. You're probably sharing some personal stories, and having that exchange with the host means you're actually sharing some personal feelings where your audience gets to hear you a little bit from the inside. Is very compelling. So that's my thought on podcasting and how personable can be, how the podcasting world is a personal way for you to connect with your audience in a meaningful way. So next up, after the call to action, is what do you do with your podcast episode after it's published, right? So for you as a podcast guest, getting on someone's platform means you have instant access to content that you can repurpose. So we're using that word repurpose. So why would you think about repurposing content that isn't in your hard drive? Well, actually, it's published material that you can point to, right? So you have access to individual links that go to, say, the Spotify episode you're on, the Apple episode you're on, the YouTube channel episode that you're on. And even if you might get an actual file copy from the host if you want to redistribute that episode. That's something that I certainly have offered to my guests before. Is anything that you want as a guest from your host about your material, ask. Most podcast hosts will have an email curated for you with links and resources of how to distribute your particular episode. I certainly do that for my guests. So at the very least, ask. But once you have that episode published, you as the guest have access to that work that you can repurpose. One of the tricks that I mentioned last time, and I would like to put this in my list to keep mentioning, is the YouTube, right? You can make your own clips from your YouTube episode, right? If you're the guest and it's not a recording that you made and saved on your hard drive, but you can go to YouTube and make your own clips from that material, right? YouTube, if you have a free account, right? You don't have to download or pay for anything. If you have a free account, you can go to YouTube and make clips that are under 1 minute, right? So that's a clip that you saw and liked on YouTube as a user, right? So what you would do as the podcast guest is go to the episode where you are appearing, like you would go to Dear Business Coach podcast on YouTube, and clip out some material from that interview that you did with me, and you can share that immediately. That's a way for you to repurpose that episode for yourself as content that you can distribute across your social and to your website. If you have a basic website where you can pop in some embedded code like a YouTube feed or a YouTube website, or excuse me, video or a social post, you can actually embed these content pieces into your website. So think about your episode as content that you yourself can repurpose. So we're back to the checklist, what to do to make your episode successful when you're a podcast guest. We talked about having your call to action ready. Remember to wrap that into your introduction, right? So when the podcast host asks you to tell everybody about yourself, have your call to action kind of wrapped in there so that your audience can find you right away as they're listening. So mine would be, my name's Elizabeth Walker, the host and producer of the Dear Business Coach podcast, and you can find me and connect with me at dearbusinesscoachpodcast.com, right? And then go right into connecting with your host. So we talked about repurposing from the YouTube video. Another thing that I like to do sometimes is remember that you can break out content based on individual links. I'm surprised sometimes still when uh, audience members or just listeners in general, friends and family will ask me, is your podcast on Apple, or is your podcast on Google, or where's your podcast? And I think, well, goodness, you go to dearbusinesscoachpodcast.com and there it is. There's a button that says select your favorite podcast player. But actually, sometimes people just want to see one link. And if you go to your social and want to go ahead and shout out, hey, friends, here's an Apple episode where I was a guest. Listen to my Apple podcast episode. You might be surprised how much you get, maybe a couple extra people responding to your content because they go, oh, I'm an Apple user, right? So they respond to that link. So you can repurpose the content of your episode where you appeared just by sharing out that episode by using either an Apple link versus a Spotify versus a YouTube link. It's 9:45, so this was a 15-minute event. And again, my name's Elizabeth, host and producer of the Dear Business Coach podcast, bringing to you this checklist on a Monday morning, what to do when you're a podcast guest. Join me again next Monday, same time, same place. 15 minutes, get your checklist on how to maximize your content when you're a guest on a podcast episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Hope you all have a great week. See you, Laura.
Thank you so much for joining me today. My name's Elizabeth, coming to you from the Walker Consulting Work Studio in Floyd, Virginia. This has been an episode of Dear Business Coach.